Yeah, once again, good morning to you and Merry Christmas to all Guyana. And of course, we're happy here once again to bring you again another program called The State of the Nation. You are aware that this program is organized and sponsored by the Burnham Foundation. With me in the studio today are Vice Chairman of the Foundation and the Chairman, two parties who will be, obviously, our program is geared to provide information and education to our people. Now, because of that, I want to go straight away to the Vice Chairman. She would be anxious to send greetings to you and to update you in relation to our other programs and activities that we got planned, not just only, say, for the festive season, but for, say, next year to commemorate the 90th birth anniversary of Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham. At this point, I want to invite Mrs. Julianne Gaul to perhaps update us as to what is happening. Morning, Julianne. How are you doing?
Thank you very much, Mr. Hinds. Good morning. Good morning to our viewers. Season greetings to one and all on behalf of the Burnham Foundation, and we would also like to thank you for your participation during the year and wish to encourage you to continue to support us during the New Year 2013. We have a few activities planned to commemorate the birth anniversary of our founder leader under the theme Burnham's Legacy and His Relevance for Guyana Today. Some of those activities would be a concert. If you will recall, we had one last year, which was this year as a matter of fact, which was very successful, and we'll be having another one in February.
Yes, I remember that concert, Julian. I think that we did charge them only $500 to attend that concert. And of course, the artists that we had, those persons who attended, they said clearly we should have charged a little more. But for this year, we have acceded to that request, and we're going to just charge them $1,000.
A donation.
A donation. I like that term.
We'll be having the annual church service and our symposium and conference. And
where will you have the church service? Where the church service?
The church service will be kept at the Methodist Church in Kitty, where our founder leader used to worship.
Okay, go ahead.
And the 90-mile cycle race commemorate his 90th birthday, so we'll have 90 miles this year.
Tell me something about the church service. I mean, is there anything specially being arranged for this church service, or just a straightforward church service you're going to be having? Will you be having?
We would have more details prior to the activity, but this is just to inform the viewers of what are some of the activities coming up.
Could you give us a little insight as to what the kind of symposium will look like for the?
We haven't confirmed our guest speakers yet, so I wouldn't want to be preemptive or presumptuous, but
okay.
It would be a very informative program, and under the theme Burnham's Legacy and His Relevance for Guyana Today.
Well, of course, our programs and our activities is in keeping with a particular plan we have to make sure people are informed and educated in relation to things Forbes Burnham. Like I said, with me in the studio today is Mr. Vincent Alexander. He's the chairman of the foundation. And we have been looking at a number of subject areas that covers Burnham over the past years. But we have not been able to touch very deeply on religion. Christmas is part of the Christian religion. And under Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham, he took the religious observances of the various denominations and religious organizations in this country very seriously. So today, what we will do, since it's the Christmas season, I want to invite Mr. Alexander, that is Mr. Vincent Alexander, to perhaps just look at this question of Burnham and religion. Could you, Vincent, just give us some comments or views in relation to Burnham?
Thank you very much, Clayton. First of all, I'd like to join with yourself and Ms. Gaul to extend season greetings to the Guyanese populace out there, to wish them a Christ-like Christmas and a prosperous New Year. And I think that's a good note to start on, a Christ-like Christmas. Because when we talk about Burnham and religion, one of the criticisms that we hear about Burnham was that he sought to de-emphasize Christmas. And what we want to do is to give clear understanding to what that meant. Because for him, de-emphasizing Christmas was not about taking religion or Christ out of Christmas. In fact, his view was that Christmas should be Christ-centered. And the de-emphasizing of Christmas really was about de-commercializing Christmas, allowing people to understand that Christmas was not about commerce. It's not about spending all that you would have saved during the year. It is about showing appreciation of the birth of the Christ child, being able to introspect and to see to what extent you were guided by the tenets of the Christ child, and to spend that season expressing an appreciation of that birth. Now, in that regard, do understand that the giving of gifts would be a part of what happened, because indeed when the Christ child was born, we know that at the very inception he himself was given gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So that, yes, gifts are a part of it, but Burnham saw that a lot of people were caught up in the commercialization of Christmas, were not necessarily paying as much attention to the real activity, which was the anniversary of the birth of the Christ child, and all that pertains, all that was pertinent to that birth. And so in some regards they were not being sufficiently religious. And so I think this is the very first point we want to make. When you talk about Christmas, and you talk about Burnham and de-emphasizing Christmas, it is a falsehood to suggest that Burnham was anti-celebration of the birth of the Christ child. In fact, what he was for was to emphasize the birth of the Christ child and to de-emphasize the commercialism which became and is still associated with Christmas.
I want to go Vincent, on the religious observances that exist in Guyana today. Christmas, like you rightly pointed out, in fact, I myself didn't even know that you had known so in depth on Burnham and this idea of Christmas. I'm not too much of a Christmas man myself, but what I wish would like you to kind of comment on, there are other organizations, religious organizations that kind of practices various religious activities, like the Hindus, the Muslims. Our country is made up of Muslim, Hindus, Christians, Baha'is, and other organizations. How do you see Burnham's role as being a Christian? Of course, he was a member of the Methodist Church in Kitty. His role to those other organizations, and what did he do in relation to the country religious organization?
Well, in the fact of the matter is that as Burnham talked about emphasizing Christmas from the standpoint of the birth of the Christ child, during the period of his regime, he recognized that Guyana was a multiracial society, multi-ethnic society, that there were people of different religious persuasions, that in the context of people's right of association, people's right of expressing their own conscience, that recognition had to be given to these various people and their religions. And so in that regard, Burnham did all that was necessary to preserve the people's right to observe and to be involved in their various religions. And it's against that background we had inherited from the British a more or less state that was associated with the Anglican Church and with the Catholic Church to a large extent. And so those activities associated with those religions were already recognized. Christmas and Easter and other such festivities were on the calendar of the nation and were public holidays, but the other religions did not benefit in that way. And so, in recognition of the people's right to the freedom of expression, association, conscience, and worship, he went ahead and ensured that all of the religions were accredited holidays to mark their major days. And in consultation with the Hindus and with the Muslims, we then had a number of other religious holidays being placed on the national calendar. So we now know about Diwali, we now know about Pagwa, we now know about Idul Adha, and all of those various religious festivals of the Hindus and Muslims were placed on the calendar, because in fact Guyana has three major religions, the Christian religion, the Hindu religion, and the Muslim religion. So that Burnham really was someone who felt that people had a right, and that the state had to provide for people to exercise those rights, and in that regard introduced these various holidays to ensure that all peoples could have in fact celebrate their various festivities and religious occasions in a manner in which the Christians had been doing from the inception of the state of Guyana.
What you said that of course it was recognized just before our independence and maybe subsequent independence that Easter, Christmas, and those religious festivities which came under the Christian calendar. Now, what you think was the motive? You did say that maybe it's to give a more holistic approach and to represent the ethnic composition of the nation. What used to happen then with those other kind of religious organizations as far as their festivities are concerned? Was there any collaboration, support, and so on from Christian community in relation to those organizations?
I would put it this way. Guyana was a colony. The colonizer was Britain. In Britain, there's a close relationship between the state and the church, and the Anglican Church per se. That was reflected here in Guyana as well, in terms of how they dealt with religion. And so other groups would have had some scope at the community level to practice their religions, but at the national level, to a large extent, there was an imposition of the Christian faith on the Guyanese people. Not that they were forced necessarily to go to church, but there were a number of institutions that were critical to the state, which were under religious control. And the major such institution, I would say, was the school system. Okay. Most of the primary schools were church schools, and a significant number of the secondary schools were also church schools. Immediately, St. Joseph comes to mind, St. Roses come to mind, St. Stanislaus comes to mind. All of those were church schools. And what you found happening in very many instances is that for enrollment in these schools, people found it necessary to have names that were typical English names. And so you found a number of Indo-Guyanese would, separate and apart from their traditional name, their Hindu name, have an anglicized name, an English name, that would facilitate their relationship with the church. Mm. And so in a sense it was imposing on people at the national level that they didn't have that complete freedom to express themselves in keeping with their own religious beliefs. In the schools as well, very often, because the schools were church schools, the manager of the school was the priest of the parish. And for someone to get a job in the school, we didn't have the Ministry of Education playing the role it now played. The manager of the parish had to play a part in the recruitment of teachers. And because the school was itself an extension of the church, and in the school there were practices associated with a particular religion, the managers preferred teachers who were of the faith.
Who were in the church.
Who were of the faith, who were in the church. And so a lot of people virtually, in some pretensive manner, sought an association with the church because it meant that we then have access to jobs. And teaching was one of the larger professions in the country. So that a lot of Indo-Guyanese, in particular, adopted anglicized and English names so as to get a foothold and an association with the church, primarily because they wanted the exposure to education and they wanted the opportunity to have jobs. Now, this could be seen as an imposition and as a form of discrimination because the state has an obligation to ensure that people can practice their beliefs.
Freedom of conscience.
Freedom of conscience.
Freedom of conscience, yes.
Ensure that people can have equal opportunity in terms of jobs, but that is not what pertained. And so when Burnham sought to introduce national holidays, he was already signaling a movement in the direction of making sure that people would have that freedom across the board. And so he went beyond national holidays. And he did something which some people still talk about today, not understanding the full impact of what he was doing. He, to a large extent, nationalized the schools. He brought all the schools under the secular state. And so he removed that connection between the schools
and the church.
And the church in a way in which it allowed for the multi-ethnic society to enjoy education without having to subject itself to a particular faith. Mm-hmm. Now, there are lots of people today who would say, well, we want prayers back in the school. And I don't think that was the issue, merely having prayers in school. Indeed, you can have prayers in school even today, and different people of different faiths can be allowed to say the relevant prayer. But in those days, it was just one prayer you could say, and the prayer is defined by the church that controlled the school. Some people would say we need to have religious knowledge back in school. And again, the question is not a question of banning religious knowledge, but if you have religious knowledge, people of different faiths must be exposed to the teachings of their faith. And probably you can have comparative religious knowledge so people can have some exposure to the religious knowledge of the various faiths. But
that exists in the country. There were various faiths.
In the country, but in those days that is not what pertained. One was merely exposed to one set of thoughts. So that one has to be careful here and not to see Burnham as being anti-religion, not see Burnham as being anti the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church, but as being the protector of the people and ensuring that we went beyond the dominance of these churches facilitated by the state and allowed for a wider involvement of the religious community in the affairs, in their own affairs, in an uninhibited way, because they were inhibited when you have to virtually play hide and seek about what your religion is. And so, in an uninhibited way, to allow people to practice their religion and to allow people to have access to education without any discriminatory practices associated with which religion they belong to. So this is the point we want to make very clear. Burnham did not advocate anything anti-religion or anti-particular denomination. What he did was open the spectrum to all denominations, and acts that he took, such as the nationalization of schools, have to be seen in that context. It's a much wider context, and there's no way in the modern world that we can revert to what pertained before. I think the world accepts that, in fact, if there is an education system, then the system must provide for people being able to attend schools and not have a particular religion imposed upon them. Now, this raises another question. We have had a resurgence of church schools in the country.
Yeah, I was just about to come to that.
We've had that resurgence. Now,
in fact, there are a number of church schools right now.
Right. The Muslims have their church schools, the Christians have church schools. There are a number of church schools in the country. But the situation is now different. You have church schools, but you also have a significant number of public schools that are secular, the schools of the state. Now, in the days I'm talking about, you didn't have that number of schools of the state. So you were bound to be associated with the church schools. So the presence of church schools is not something anybody wants to restrict. But what happens now is that you have a choice.
Mm-hmm.
You have sufficient public schools within the state system that can allow for children to go to those schools without having to subject themselves to a faith to which they don't belong.
Mm-hmm.
And if per chance they belong to a particular faith, then so be it. They have a choice of attending the school of that faith as well.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole scenario has changed. In the old days, you didn't have that number of state schools. In fact, the school system had its origin in the churches.
Mm-hmm.
And most of these primary schools in particular were church schools. And so there was an imposition that was taking place through the presence of those schools in that form. That has changed. We now have the public schools, and of course, in the same vein of people having the right of association, freedom of conscience and all of that, one would expect and accept that there can be church schools, and that those church schools can be for a particular faith. People now have a choice. They don't have to go change their name because it's the only way to get a job in a school. The public school system is there for all at large, and the church schools are there for those who wish to express themselves that way.
I want to tell our viewers, I just want to tell our viewers now that the lines will be open. Remember, we are looking at Burnham and religion. And we would like to tell you also that, in fact, I have a message for a lady that called into this program a few programs earlier on, Mrs. Semple. I just want to tell you, if you're listening to this program today, that I have your CD of the programs that you had requested. So tomorrow, I promise I have your number, and I will call you to make sure that I get those copies of those tapes for you, because you said you wanted them so you can play them back for your children and grandchildren so they can listen to things born on. Now, I want to tell our viewers, like I said, that the lines are open. You can call and comment in relation to this question we're discussing today, Burnham and religion. And we're looking at this whole idea of Christmas and religion in Guyana generally. Now, I want to pose a question out for the general public. This question of religion, is it psychological? That's a question I want you maybe to address if you're going to be calling in. And I remember there were some other organizations which I don't think you addressed, those faithist organizations that had no status at all when I was growing up. Those organizations were kind of looked down upon, kind of ridiculed. People used to attach names to them when they see people who were part of that. What did Burnham do about it?
Well, that's another important point that you have raised, the whole question of the religious spectrum and people having a freedom of conscience and being able to practice their faith. In Guyana, like most of the British countries, over time, there were laws which evolved that curtailed certain practices. And, these practices were referred to as obeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, interesting that those practices were associated with, as I said, certain faiths, what one may call the faithist church.
Mm-hmm.
But the faithist church, there are two aspects to people of those faiths. There are the general religious practices, which do not fall under the ambit of what is called obeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are practices by individuals of those faiths that may fall under the ambit of what is called obeah. But when the state took action against obeah, rightly or wrongly, the entire body of people were tarnished and not allowed to practice their faith. So that even the general practices, which definitionally are not obeah, became entrapped.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you had was an entire group of people being looked upon as doing something that was wrong, illegal, etc. And so in this context of the freedom of conscience, Burnham also, what they said was legalize obeah. But what he was really doing was removing that
Stigma.
from people who were essentially involved in the
Let's take this call, Vincent. Morning, you're on the air.
Speak up.
Hello?
Yes, I'm hearing you.
Let's speak up.
Congratulations, gentlemen, looking as far back as you are.
Huh?
From the leader of this nation, discussing him with the Pope Samson Burnham in the context of religion. But I believe there's some fundamental. Firstly, we need to determine who Burnham was as a person of his own religious belief and foundation. In that context, that will probably give us some insight or foresight, if you would like to look at it in terms of back what the man really on, and as far as allowing persons to retain their identity of their origin, and at the same time getting a fair and reasonable opportunity, because I can't say fair and full opportunity. I have fair and reasonable opportunity as far as the education opportunities and other social opportunities for work and economic development is concerned. Now, if you were to look back at an evolving nation in the context of the immediate years pre-independence.
He needs to speak up, and I don't think the public would be hearing the question.
I'm barely hearing you. I have to get my technician to perhaps give me a little bit more volume here, because I think that you're raising some very important points. But the points are here. We will try to deal with that. But of course, at the conclusion of your call, obviously I'll have to get a technician to address this question of the volume so that people could hear.
Sorry, Mr. Hinds, I'll try to speak a little louder.
Yes, good, please.
I want to suggest, for all intents and purposes, that a man's philosophical belief as a leader has got some impact insofar as an evolving nation is concerned. And there is where, because of political and other social reasons, in the formative years of this country, post-independence, it was essential for any leader, as far as I can determine, to impose some of his own philosophical beliefs and thinking insofar as creating that distinction between political opportunity and leveraging political power.
Mm-hmm.
Not suggesting by any means that we were dominated in that context by the late Lyndon Pope Samson Burnham. But Guyana has been brought up with a very profound religious foundation as an inheritance from our British upbringing.
Yes.
And in no way was it interfered with in the context of the leader of this nation at that time, the Burnham that we're discussing. What we have found in the name aspects of things, as Mr. Alexander pointed out in his comments earlier, that there were some amount of, I would call it incursion to other areas by persons changing their first name to identify with a certain ethnic or racial group.
Yeah, but religious and body, right.
Opportunities. Whether that was psychological or not is an issue of what I would term opportunism. And in every context, I believe, according to the Bible, man must always know himself.
Yes.
Notwithstanding his motivations for power or for money, you must stand firm on your identity. When I came back to this country, having lived here and had my earlier years in terms of career development in Guyana, and gone outside and lived about this equal amount of years, when I got back to Guyana, I found that within a matter of 2 decades, there were a larger number of Indo-Guyanese adopting African first names. For what reason, I couldn't imagine. Because I found that to be a sort of, comedy of sorts.
Yes.
So far as our identity and our belief in ourselves.
Well, kind of wrong off your point. Wrong off your point. Yes.
On this issue, Guyanese need to standpoint that our philosophical beliefs must not be derailed by any psychological impact or political leveraging that is concerned with our development as we go from strength to strength in this context.
All right.
And I thank you, gentlemen, for discussing such a sensitive topic at this point in our history. Good luck to you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, you have made a point. You were saying that Forbes Burnham, that was a situation that existed then. And what Burnham did, like Vincent pointed out, is that he sought to change that, because we had Christians, we had Hindus, we had Muslims, all in this country, and there were some problems being faced because of our history. We were brought up and was made to think along the line that people ought to only observe the Christian holidays, Christian festivals, and so on. And those are things that Forbes Burnham changed. We're getting another call. Thank you. Yes, you're on the air.
Good morning to you, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Morning, sir.
I would want to say that Mr. Burnham and the religion was to bring you to the conscious understanding of yourself. And that is what he was fostering. I heard Mr. Alexander spoke just now about the Faithist organization, which is a semblance of African spirituality.
That's right.
And unless you have that spirituality within you, you are unable to really fathom your way through this life.
Mm-hmm.
And that understanding, as the fellow before was talking about leadership. And if you do not have that spiritual value within you, you would never be able to conquer all the adversities that comes up against you. It is likewise to say that I'm a Christian. Yes, and when I'm a Christian, to take away my identity from me and remove from me that spirituality that is within me that comes directly to me and not by a teaching of a book or anything. But when I am spiritually inclined, I am able to understand my life and run better. It is just like what is happening with the argument they have as to where to put that monument for the persons of African descent who would have suffered then. Mm-hmm. If we were in one community of a spiritual life, we would have found that, well, all of us as Africans would have come out and spoken with one voice that, hey, put that monument where we say that it belongs. But because of that spiritual life not being there, we find that you will have a division between those who call themselves Christians and those who call themselves spiritual leaders and so forth. So this is what Mr. Burnham was fighting for, to bring the African people, especially as the Hindus, they stay Hindus, as the Muslims, they stay Muslims, no matter what. And I think that we, as African descendants, supposed to be in that spiritual light as to the Africans, and not to be, allowing ourselves to take away from ourselves that which belongs to us, and that is what he was trying to do. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Okay, thank you. You want to comment?
I would comment on that to say that I don't think that Burnham's focus was specifically the African people. I think his focus was the Guyanese people and their rights. What is important to note is that different peoples were at different states because of what colonization had done. And so probably one could argue that the African people were the most disadvantaged. And because they were the most disadvantaged, the framework Burnham was creating was going to give them an opportunity they did not previously have. And they were going to be able to make greater use of that opportunity because other religions and other peoples were further along the continuum of freedom of expression of conscience as opposed to the faithists. Okay. So Burnham's focus was not the faithists. Burnham's focus was the Guyanese. But the faithists and the African Guyanese would have benefited because having come as slaves, they were the ones whose culture and beliefs was most suppressed and therefore could most benefit from a regime that sought to liberalize the spectrum of religion.
Let me take this call, Vincent. I think, we have lost that call.
No, so let me go back to the earlier point I was making. This question of the Obia. There were some people who kind of collapsed Obia to mean the Faithist Church. And that is not correct. And because they collapsed it to mean the Faithist Church, then the Faithist Church came under a stigma that interfered with them having that freedom of expression, freedom of conscience. So when Burnham decriminalized Obia, what in fact he was doing really was removing the stigma that would then allow for the Faithists to come into their own and to be able to practice the religion in a way in which they were not practicing it before. And that was not in itself the practice of Obia. Because
let's take this call.
An individualized practice.
Let's take this call. Morning, you on here.
Yes, a pleasant good morning, gentlemen. I'm listening to you fellas there, and I'm somewhat motivated to contribute. First of all, Christmas greetings to you fellas and your families.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I have been listening to Mr. Alexander especially, and I think one other great point I would have liked him to make, and I will make that point, is that Burnham legalized or liberalized religion and the practice of religion for all Guyanese.
That's right.
Whatever form. To the extent I can remember in the mid-80s when I traveled to Antigua, and Antiguan confronted me and said, "Hey, you come from Guyana? You come from Guyana where the previous Prime Minister legalized Obia?" And I had to put him in his place. I said, Guyana doesn't have Obia. Guyana has groups of people who practices some form of spirituality which they believe in. We can even go to the Hindus. They have what you call the Kalimite Church. Within the Hindu religion, that's a part of spiritual practice. Just like how within the Christian organization we have those folks that they call these fellas that wear the long white robes and all of that.
But the Jordanites.
The Jordanites. You know, they have their way of spiritual practice. So the bottom line that Guyanese need to understand, and I love this program, because what Burnham did for this country is not being elaborated as to be able to educate the present populace. The young generation, they don't know the truth about what Burnham did. And
that's the whole purpose of our program, to really inform and educate.
To educate, because Burnham liberalized religion in whatever form. And I think we should give him applause for that. Because before his liberalizing, and it is even stated in our Constitution, that's what one must also understand. That constitutionally.
The previous caller said that to do that, if you're a leader, you're faced with various ethnic groups within your country, you have to have that inner spirituality to do that. And that's what Burnham did.
Definitely. And then moreover, because if he did not have that spiritual quality, he would not have been able to appreciate and respect the practice of And that's a very good thing that he did, and I think we ought to give him a applause for that. Anyhow, gentlemen, I'm listening to your program, I'm enjoying it, and I hope you fellas continue doing these kind of programs.
Oh, thank you.
God's blessings and be good.
Okay, thank you.
I have no quarrel with the point. In fact, I think I was making the same point, though the language might have been different. That, in fact, the spectrum of religion, Burnham allowed a lot of liberty in that spectrum. And the impact would have been most evident among the African Guyanese, because they're the ones who were largely discriminated against. I mean, I started off by identifying the issues with the Hindus and their names and things like that. But the fetists were altogether stigmatized. And so they weren't on the spectrum at all.
Let's take this call. Morning, you're on the air.
Yeah, good morning to you.
Morning, sir.
Very good program. And I'd like to make my contribution. I could remember as a small boy when this whole thing happened. And religions was, everything went on the same flat. Because I grew up, had to go to Catholic school and them kind of things. But what I want to say is this, is that, and the point was made that it's more or less where the African man, he was the most man that was more penalized for his religious understandings than anybody else. And the point was being made, or they was trying to make a separation between what we call fetists and obia. But the fetists used to get penalized because their churches were more or less African-oriented. As against obia, whereby obia was more or less indigenously an African understanding, like what is being practiced in Haiti, and you can find some semblance of it in Jamaica and Venezuela and so forth and so on. To the point that when they had the last earthquake in Haiti, they had a set of people jump out and holler, hey, it's because they just do deal with voodoo. And the same stigmatization continues to go on. The point what I'm trying to make is this, is that in all civilizations, you will always be suppressed once you are a conquered people. Your masters or your conquerors will always be afraid of you. In order, when you are practicing what belongs to you, it is always be afraid that should you continue to practice what belongs to you, you gain strength and power that one day you will judge him for what he has done to you. And that is the main reason why these things do happen. So if tomorrow you find, and you can go and examine it, you can go across in the Islamic countries, you can see that here beside the Christian churches there, you can see they do suppress them, and there are reasons to people complain for suppression. You can find it, if you go to Europe, you can find it, and I'm widely traveled. I see 4 or 5 countries in this world, and I know where I'm coming from.
All right.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, the point I want to make here is that obia as a practice is an individualized practice where you have particular practitioners who do acts that are referred to as obia. That is separate and apart from the rituals and the practices of the church as a collective body of people. But these things were collapsed into one. And banning obia affected the church as well. But even in terms of obia, on this program we are not ourselves advocating any of these religious perspectives. We're not advocating any of them, but we're just creating a framework to say, here is how Burnham sought to give people an opportunity to practice what they were entitled to practice. So that even if one looks at obia, what was obia really? Obia really is where individuals had practices that sought to give favor to people. You go to an obia man for favor, and the obia man will do whatever he had to do to try to get you that favor. I find it interesting that even today in the evangelic churches, you go for favor. And this is not at the level of the ceremony of the church or the everyday practice of the church. You have specific days and activities and practitioners to whom you go to for favor. So the point I want to make here too is that a lot of things that were stigmatized in the Faithist church, one can find parallels of these things in other religions. There are tremendous similarities, for example, between some of the practices of the Faithist church and the Hindu church.
That's right.
There's startling parallels. But here was one church stigmatized for what they were doing, and another one was not stigmatized. And so what Burnham started to do is to say, look, give everybody a fair chance.
Let's take this call. Morning, you're on the air.
Yes, good morning again. Sorry to dominate the program, and I really support what Mr. Alexander has just said and the point of parallels. Let me point out something that happened this year. This year, the Pope visited Benin, the only country that remains in Africa that has an indigenous religion, African religion as its national religion, as against the other rest of states, the other rest of 52 states that are mainly Muslims and Christians or what have you. And the Pope and his people was asking the people of Benin to give up their national and their indigenous religion, which they worship they worship at the temple of the Python. But if you should translate the name St. Peter's Basilica, Basilica means the temple of the serpent the same way too. But how is it you want me to give up? You think the thing is it is a whole political thing and it's more or less for power and control. And that is why I agree with Mr. Alexander when he turns and tell you that there are parallels. There are parallels all over.
Yes.
So when he made the point with the evangelical church, with the person going for favor, it is the same naked thing. Nothing's different.
Okay.
But just that we all are putting words over our eyes and do not want to look at things as what they really are. Thank you very much.
Well, that is precisely what Burnham did. He made the thing a level playing field for everybody. That's one of the reasons, like the caller said, you have to have that spiritual inequality to do things like that. I did pose a question earlier, this whole question of religion. Is it psychological? I haven't heard anyone commenting on that yet, but we will take this other call. Morning, you're on the air.
A pleasant morning to you, gentlemen.
Morning.
This is Vincent in your partner.
Yes, morning.
I just want to draw some of your attention. I'm 74 now, and I can remember when I was a small boy. People from Georgetown used to left to go to Borby's at Cotton Tree Murad, a man named Cotton Tree Murad. A Muraji name, but he's from Cotton Tree. To these same favors, what they call in Obio. Most times, most of the people used to perform these rites for the pandits. So what you call to that, so what the Prime Minister said is we practice Burnham thing Obio. So those religious things that they had before, Kalamai Puji and all these things, it is. Okay, yes, and just explain it to me.
Yeah. It's a similarity that Vincent was talking about. Vincent will make that.
I mean, if every church, every denomination, when you go, you see they have rituals. And these rituals have historical origins, whether they believe in the use of water. And in fact, most religions use water for one thing or the other. And some of them believe in different elements of nature. But they all see this as manifestations of God and of a way of establishing a relationship with God, because these things are all products of the great Creator. But somewhere along the line, some are categorized one way and others are categorized another way. I mean, you go to the Catholic Church and you have the Holy Mary, and there's a practice of virtual worship.
Let me take this call, Vincent. Morning, you're on the air.
Yes, I'm sorry to get back onto you. But what I'm saying also, one of the things that Mr. Burnham would have seen as a leader with a vision was the sale of this. As he oftentimes spoke about Damon when he was about to be hung, when he tell them what we've been said, we don't say already, there's the next part that he also said. They may take this life, but never allow them to take the spirituality that is within you away from you. They may do these things to us, but continue to hold on for that which was given unto you from creation. And you know, we know that the black man, he was that was beaten out of him not to have what is his. And this is what Mr. Burnham tried to do, that every single person, every Guyanese, must continue in the way of the ancestral behavioral pattern, not to encroach on anyone, not to dismember anyone by telling them that what you have is my own is better more than you.
Okay.
You know, let us all join together and use it for a betterment of each and every one. That was his main aim, to bring us all. Even though you are what you are, we can all preach and say, as Johnny Mattis in the song said, one God. No matter what we talk, all we talk into one God.
One God.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think there are two important points that are emerging. That the human being is a spiritual as well as a physical being. and that what in fact Burnham was doing, African slaves were liberated physically, but there was a suppression. Indo-Guyanese indentured laborers were liberated physically, but the suppression. And so he was providing liberation in the spiritual spectrum so that you could be a fullness of the people of Guyana. You couldn't be that fullness if they are suppressed in terms of their spiritual being and what he's providing for. So that he was not advocating a particular religion, he was creating a framework within which the various peoples who came to this country could realize their full being at the level of the physical and spiritual existence.
Morning, you on the air.
Yes, good season greetings, sir.
Season's greetings.
Yes, religion is psychological and not spiritual. It's a replacement of spirituality.
I didn't get you.
Yes, religion is psychological.
It is psychological.
Yes.
Okay.
It is a replacement of spirituality. It gives you recognition through group, color, and names. Have a blessed day. Thank you.
I tell you what I propose we do. We here are not ourselves practitioners of a particular religion. And we are giving you Burnham's ideas in terms of the framework he created for people to be able to practice their religions, etc. But we will bring to you, probably in the next program, a practitioner who will be able to go into the details of these practices to show the similarities, to show the origins and things like that. So we will have a second part. We will have a second part where we can deal with the substantive religious issues as we deal with the framework on this occasion.
Morning, you on the air.
Congratulations, gentlemen. You're dealing with a serious issue here. Now, there are a lot of views being expressed. The reality is, and there is so much that I can contribute, but let me try and restrict my comments to a few things that were already discussed.
Yeah, we got to. I'm looking at the time now, so you got to.
The thing is that, you know, when Toussaint Louverture overthrew the colonial masters in Haiti, and Napoleon used his cannons and all that superior firepower they had, they were still defeated. And the colonial masters could not understand how these African slaves could defeat the most powerful army in Europe at the time with sticks and spears. And therefore, when they analyzed it, the intellectual reasoning was that it was their common religion or belief system. Religion, yes, is psychological in the sense that we are all residing in our own realities, and we are governed by our belief systems and conditioning. The Catholic Church has sought throughout the world, and even through the different religions, because every religion except the ancient traditional African religions, which dominate the world by over 70%. Never mind the fact that you don't hear about them. The majority of religions are ancient African religions, and they're the dominant ones. The Catholics control and own Islam, Christianity, and all the other religions. When you read the hymns and their religious...
You gotta make your point, because I'm looking at the time.
The point I'm making is, in all the institutions of learning, science, technology, and religion, they tend to dominate and try to suppress our innate expressions of who we are and where we came from. And that's what Burnham sought to do.
Okay.
To bring that into reality, we must be allowed to freely express ourselves. And Obia was just one of the religions that was allowed.
Okay. Like Mr. Alexander said, we will have another program on this subject, because, like I have put a question out, is it psychological? There are three major theories on religion that I know of, but when we bring the expert on these matters, hopefully we'll be able to address them and address them more holistically. What I want to tell you at this time is that I want to remind you that our programs are geared towards informing you and educating you in relation to the various topics that we address here from time to time. Our time is fast approaching for closing of this program. So what I want to do at this point is to ask the Vice Chairperson of the Foundation to remind our viewers of those activities that we got planned to commemorate the 90th birth anniversary of Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham in February. And I hope that you out there will be able to come out in full force and support us. We'll be having one of the most spectacular concerts at the Theatre Guild on the 3rd of February. Over to you, Julianne.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hinds. Just to remind viewers once again, we will be having a concert to commemorate the 90th birth anniversary of our founder leader, Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham, a church service, symposium and conference, and a 90-mile cycle race.
Why 90 mile? Oh, because it's the 90th birth anniversary.
90th, yeah.
Okay.
Under the theme Burnham's legacy and its relevance for Guyana today.
Vincent, your final comments?
Well, I would like once again to join with my colleagues here to wish the Guyanese public at large a merry season, to remind them that we embrace the idea that the season should be Christ-like.
Yes.
And that what Burnham was about was not in any way de-emphasizing the Christ-likeness of the season, but de-emphasizing the commercial nature of the season. And we embrace that idea. We think it is still relevant today. So the Burnham Foundation, in keeping with its postulation of the ideas of Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham, wish you a Christ-like Christmas and watch the commerce.
And from me to you, I want to say thank you for allowing us in your homes today. And we will be coming to you again on the 4th Sunday in January with a topic. We don't know what that will be yet, but we will coming to you with a topic to inform and educate you in relation to things Burnham. I want to thank you for being with us today and trust that you will all have a wonderful Christmas and a successful and rewarding 2013. My name is Clayton Hinds, and we take leave at this time until I see you again on the 4th Sunday in January. Thank you.